welcome everyone tonight for another meeting of our working group in political theory. My name is Richard. We are a working group of the German Association of Young Political and Social Scientists, the DNGPS. And tonight we'd like to welcome our guest Yannis Stavrakakis. Yannis is a political theorist, proponent of the Essex School of Discourse analysis. And he wrote a lot of books, among them Lacan and the Political, or also the Lacanian left, psychoanalysis, theory, politics. And we gather tonight because we'd like to discuss a new book of Yannis, which I found during my own research about populism, and which is at the moment only available in Greek: Populism, Myth, Stereotypes, and Reorientations. I think there will be an upcoming volume also in English, and because I'm really interested in this book and in this topic, I'm excited to welcome you, Yannis, tonight. Yannis studied in Essex and wrote his dissertation under the supervision of Ernesto Laclau. The title was New Directions in the Theory of Ideology in the Case of Green Ideology. And I think without any more words, I give you now time for an introduction to the book, and after this we will have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for the invitation. I will say a few things about why the book was written and how it has been published. And then I will try to present an outline of the themes that are discussed in the book. It is published by, you mentioned the title, it's Populism, Myths, Stereotypes, and Reorientations. It was commissioned by the Greek Open University Press, so it is published in a series which publishes very short books, very short introductions to a particular topic. And this is the one about populism, obviously because populism is being discussed a lot in the public debate. And the publishing house wanted to have an introductory book about this particular topic. It was published a couple of years ago, I think. It appeared a couple of years ago. There are two upcoming books in English which are in the same topic. They are not identical. There is an individual volume I'm finishing at the moment, which is on populist discourse, which will be published by Routledge. And there is also a research handbook I am editing together with Giorgos Katsambekis, my colleague from Loughborough University, an ex-PhD student of mine, which will incorporate around 40 chapters on researching populism, the conceptual aspects, the historical aspect, new challenges and things like that, especially addressed to research students. This will appear hopefully in the next couple of years. They are not the same with the one we will be discussing today, but obviously they are written or edited by the same person, so some things will be similar, I guess. Okay, let me move to the outline of the Greek book. It starts with an introduction, which is why we should study populism, whether we need something new or not. There is some sort of standard understanding, especially in Europe, a very Eurocentric understanding, which is very pejorative, very dismissive of populism, because populism obviously has been very much associated with the far right within Europe. This is a very European peculiarity in most cases. The introduction touches on the relationship between democracy and populism, and so on and so forth. We can talk about all these things in the discussion if there is interest. The first chapter is a historical chapter. It offers a brief genealogy of the populist phenomenon, because obviously, and this happens in similar introductory books which are published on different topics. You usually, when you study something, you present some sort of historical account of what is the genealogy, what is the history, the historical background of this particular discussion. This is not very, I mean, it happens a lot also with populism, but there are many cases in which people don't pay at all any attention to what is the historical use of the concept, when it emerged, how it was developed, and so on and so forth. So I thought that it is very important to have this historical contextualization. And that's why the first chapter offers this brief genealogy of populism. And it mainly, it has four sections. One about the Narodniki in Russia, Russian populism from the middle to the end of the 19th century, which was a radical movement against the Tsar. Then it moves to the United States, to North American populism of the 1890s, which was a movement, again, a very egalitarian movement, a progressive movement, which also became a party, the People's Party, or the Populist Party, because these were people that identified themselves as populists. It was not just a denunciation as it is usually utilized today. These people accepted the name populists, and it was a party that emerged to represent poor farmers and workers that felt that they are not represented by the Republican and the Democratic Party. The American political system was very similar to the one that exists today. It was a period of very aggressive capitalist modernization. These people felt that they are not really taken into account, their voice is not heard, they cannot influence decision making, and they started the cooperative movement, so-called Farmers Alliance in the beginning, which then culminated in the creation of a third party. They got around 8–9%, I think, in the presidential elections of 1892. And then they were incorporated into the Democratic Party. And it seems that they have influenced greatly the progressive tradition in the United States, and also the New Deal with Roosevelt in the 20th century. So from the Russian populist movement, radical movement, we move to more or less radical party in the United States, and then we have Latin American populism in the 40s and 50s, mainly in Argentina with Perón and in other places. And this is important because then we also have these forces getting into government. So we have some sort of a progressive movement from movement to party in the US, and then to a party of government. And then the fourth section is about this European peculiarity that in Europe we have, during the last, I don't know, 3–4 decades, an extreme right. We have the French elections in a few days, which is one of the examples of these far-right movements that have been described as populist. And there is a section about the European experience in the last few years, in the last period. This is the first chapter of the book, the historical chapter. The conclusion of that is that in opposition to what we usually believe, the populist canon is probably left-wing, is probably egalitarian, is probably more progressive than we usually think. And I think we need to take this into account in order to contextualize the European case and somehow end up with a little bit more nuanced understanding of what populism is. The second chapter is about the theoretical and analytical mainstream in populism studies today, which is, and I provide some sort of contextualization, because up until the 50s, literature on populism is usually positive, especially in the United States, where you have this egalitarian progressive movement of the 1890s. The most historiographical analysis of populism are positive, let's say, or they study this party in a rather neutral or positive manner. And then in the 50s, we have the work of Hofstadter and the so-called pluralists, who identify with a very unilinear and very one-sided modernization thesis, which is the idea that the United States provides with some sort of TINA dogma. There is no alternative dogma of the time, that there is a unilinear modernization process, which ends up with the American model of the 20th century, a blend of capitalism and representative democracy. And that this is some sort of course that everybody has to follow. And if you disagree, or if you are one of the losers of this process and you want to demonstrate, or you want to express your alternative political orientation, and you found a party or you do something else, this is some sort of anomaly. And it's interesting that Hofstadter also publishes a book about the paranoid style in American political culture, and somehow all these people who disagree and who dissent and so on and so forth are not legitimate contenders, and their opinion has to be criticized as something very anomalous, something very problematic. And this is the moment when a lot of stereotypes, the stereotypes of my title, a lot of stereotypes emerge, like the horseshoe theory, that the extreme left or the left and the extreme right or the right are very similar, and it's only in the middle ground, following this unilinear modernization process, that we can really move forward. Of course, this framework, this matrix, is what, to a certain extent, has influenced the creation of the liberal mainstream in populism studies, and these stereotypes are still present today in many analyses of populism. So my idea was to provide a contextualization of these ideas and to show that this unilinear modernization thesis has been completely discredited since then. Very few people talk about Hofstadter anymore. Nevertheless, this schema that originated from this particular period has migrated to other parts of the world, is very much present in Europe, is very much present in Greece, and in other places, also in Latin America to a certain extent. And this is something that stands at the basis of mainstream populism research at the moment. And there is also a discussion of how this develops into other arguments, which are not exactly identical, but they draw on certain themes of Hofstadter and the pluralists of the time. And there's a discussion of Kasmude and Kaltwasser and of Jan Werner Müller. There's a discussion and a criticism of this particular understanding of populism, and this critique of populism from a liberal, more or less, perspective. There is a critique of this idea of moralization, which is very much central in this analysis. And this criticism that I'm trying to develop clears the ground for a new perspective, which is what I want to do basically in the book. So the third chapter is trying to introduce an alternative perspective, which is not to say that we need to embrace populism or that we want to be positive about all types of populism. No, this is not my argument, but my argument is that we need to arrive at a more nuanced, a more sophisticated framework of analysis, which incorporates this historical contextualization, this genealogy of populism within history, that incorporates this criticism and realizes more or less the shortcomings of the mainstream from the 50s up until today, and offers some insights into how we could probably arrive at this more nuanced perspective on populism, that just like what we do with other phenomena, we have to see how they manifest themselves, what is their history, what are their particular manifestations, different contexts, and we have to judge them on their own right without, it is very difficult to avoid all stereotypes, because researchers are also citizens. They have some sort of view about politics. It's not always possible to arrive at a purely neutral or a decontextualized objective position, but nevertheless we can try to bracket our preferences and try to judge all phenomena in front of us in the same way, with the same standards. And this is what I'm trying to do, and I'm drawing on, Richard has already mentioned that I am drawing on the discourse theory initiated by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, and of course Laclau's and Mouffe's work on populism, because populism has been very central in this, in the development of this perspective. I mean, Laclau himself points out that it is the analysis of populism that puzzled him already from his years in Argentina in the 60s. And that is what triggered his interest in post-structuralism and Derrida, Lacan, I don't know, linguistics, and all these theoretical resources and conceptual resources that he tried to incorporate into a single framework in order to analyze politics, whether we call it discourse theory or whether we call it post-Marxism or something else, the Essex school. This strong interest by Laclau on populism has led him to publish a series of articles and books on this issue. Already from the 70s, in his first book, Politics and Ideology in Marxist Theory, there is a chapter on populism. And this, of course, culminated in his book exclusively devoted to this phenomenon, the one on populist reason, published in 2005, where he especially tries to utilize psychoanalytic theory and other theoretical resources in the analysis of populism. I am trying to use all these materials in order to develop this more nuanced account, and some other perspectives which could be interesting for our purposes. And I'm trying to answer a few questions. I will try to present them to you. I cannot present, obviously, in what is a very short presentation, all the contents of the book, but I can give you an idea of what I discuss in this third chapter, which is the final chapter. It's only 3 chapters. The book is, how many pages is it? It's around 100 pages long. So the first question is why populism exists. And here I am also using a lot of more traditional political theory and an understanding of the development of democracy and representative government in the last few centuries. And I'm also trying to use other resources like the idea of moral economy introduced by E.P. Thompson, because my idea, this can be very much articulated with discourse theory, because the idea of E.P. Thompson, for example, is when he studies the English crowd in the 18th century, he's trying to analyze why people protest. And we know that people do not protest all the time. I remember the book by Barrington Moore, which is called Injustice. And Barrington Moore starts by observing that when you have injustice in a society, people do not automatically resist or protest. In some cases they do, in some other cases they don't. So the big question for social and political theory is why in some cases they do that and in some other cases do something else. And I think E.P. Thompson provides an answer to this, because he argues that there is no automatic reaction, but the reaction is mediated by a certain discursive framework which legitimizes a certain action against what is happening. And this in pre-modern societies or in early modernity, what legitimizes this protest is the pre-existing moral economy, so to speak. Even in situation in which you do not have a democratic or a representative system, and you have a system which is aristocratic, or you have a king or something else, there is some sort of, there is a question of legitimacy. This system has to be legitimized somehow. And it is usually legitimized in a paternalist, let's say, way. That is to say, the lower classes have to accept the system, have to respect the hierarchy and all that stuff. But on the other hand, the people who govern have to protect these lower classes. If they are going to die from starvation because we had a bad crop, we have a bad season in terms of crops, and the prices of bread are going up, or if something other happens, they have to offer some protection. And if they don't, if they fail to offer this protection, this is the idea of the moral economy. If they fail to offer this protection, that gives the right to the lower classes to go out and demonstrate and express their disagreement and demand something different. When we pass, my idea is that when we pass to constitutional democracies, you don't have a moral, I mean, you have, maybe you have a moral economy, but on the other hand, you also have a constitutional document, which is usually articulated around popular sovereignty. And that principle, that accepted principle, provides the legitimizing framework for these demands and for these protests, because obviously you have this promise of popular sovereignty, but then, as with many other cases, when you make a promise, the difference, there's usually a difference between promise and reality. And when this reality does not honor, or some people, some sectors of the population think or feel that their voice is not heard, that the promise is not honored properly, and that representation is not adequate, then they feel they have to protest, they have to do something different, they have to start a new movement, a new party, and demand this popular sovereignty, which is not present in their own reality, in the reality they experience every day. And this is, I think, the basis of many populist movements. And since we never have a pure identification between a promise and a reality, this means that populism will never cease to exist. I mean, if we stay within a representative democratic system which includes popular sovereignty in its founding principles, then we are bound to see this type of politics. There are cycles of populist mobilizations which demand that the principle is properly honored. So this is the genetic aspect, if you want, of why populism exists and why it will probably never cease to exist within. So populism is not some sort of anomaly that will go away just out of itself. It's something that is part of the representative democratic system, because there is always, and especially when we pass to competitive elitism, and you have elites which govern, sometimes people will feel, certain sectors will feel that they are not represented and that they need a better representation, they need their demands to be heard and their voice to be heard, and then you will have populism. That gives me the opportunity to offer the minimal criteria that a discursive perspective accepts in order to identify these movements or parties or leaders or whatever as populists, which is mainly a main reference to the people and to popular sovereignty for the reasons I have just explained. This is the first criterion. The second criterion is that this happens in a dichotomic antagonistic schema. That is to say, you have a division of society, a representation of the social and political space as a space divided between the establishment, the governing elite, the oligarchy, and the people who are not properly represented and demand some sort of better representation. These are the two main minimal criteria. And then I discuss this issue, what is the relationship between populism and nationalism, because this is the basis of the identification of populism with the extreme right within the European sphere. How can we introduce some other criteria in order to distinguish whether we are talking about populism or whether we're talking about nationalism? It's not the same. There are articulations, especially because we all live in nation states and some reference to the nation is standard in all political discourse. But there are ways to distinguish whether we are talking about a predominantly nationalist movement or a predominantly populist movement. And the criteria here, I can refer to this very briefly, and maybe we can return during the discussion. The first criterion is whether the people which is posited in a populist discourse is because the people is not a pre-existing reality, it is an invocation that the populist discourse brings into life. The populist discourse produces the people. The question is, when in populist discourse we have a reference to the people, is this people an empty signifier? This is a concept introduced by Lacan. Is it an empty signifier? That is to say, you have populist discourses in which everybody can become a member of this popular political subject. Even if you are an immigrant, if you belong to the lower classes and so on and so forth, you can become part of the people. Or is it a signifier that corresponds to a mythical signification of national unity to something else, then maybe you have a predominantly nationalist discursive construction, which just associates the nation with the people. And the second criterion is that usually in populist discourse, in populist discourses proper, you have an antagonistic scenario which is vertical. That is to say, you have the elite up there, and you have the people in the bottom of the vertical high-low axis. In predominantly nationalist or far-right discourses, the antagonism is mainly horizontal. That is to say, it is fashioned along a nationalist perspective, the in-group and the out-group, so the immigrants become part of the adversary, of the elite. And of course, in some cases, you have both. You have hybrids, discursive hybrids, which are both nationalist and populist. This can also happen. And we have to judge every case on its own right, with the same standards, with the same criteria, and arrive at a conclusion whether we are dealing with a predominantly nationalist discourse, whether we are dealing with a predominantly populist discourse, and so on and so forth. And then there is a section, and I will conclude my presentation with that because I see that I'm almost reaching half an hour. The final section, I mean, there are two sections, two additional sections. After this discussion of what is populist and what is not populist, I'm also discussing clientelism and other things which are not populist. There is the issue of how can we talk about populism in a more nuanced way, or even in some cases in a positive way, because some of these movements are positive and some other are very negative. It's a question of context and of the particular movement we are studying. But how can we do that if everybody believes that this is a pejorative word and so on and so forth? And I'm mainly arguing that this happens with all categories of political theory and political analysis. Sometimes they start as positive, they become negative, and populism itself started as positive, became negative. It can become positive again, or it can become sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And there are also other concepts like queer, for example. The concept of queer, it was a derogatory concept, it was a pejorative concept, and now we have queer studies, we have queer political movements, and so on and so forth. So the same can happen with populism. There is no reason why it should not happen, or there is no reason, of course, on the other hand, that predicts that it will necessarily happen. So the question is open. And the final section is about the limits of populism, because there are obviously many limits also to populism, especially in its particular manifestations in Latin America, in Europe, and so on and so forth. And we have always to keep in mind that we have to judge this phenomenon, as with all other social and political phenomena, with an open mind in order to identify the genealogy, the historical context, the particular manifestation, and then to evaluate its characteristics in relationship with democracy. Sometimes it can be favorable for a deepening democracy, or some other times it can be very negative, and it can be a danger to democracy. So this is the basic outline of the book. And these are also the themes that, because the book draws on a series of articles that have been published over the years through a research project, Populism, that we ran for a couple of years, 2014 and 2015, at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, which studied we did field work in Latin America, in the United States, in Europe, and in many places. We had conferences, workshops, we published a few articles, and these are the context, the intellectual context within these whole arguments, and these themes are elaborated. So I think I can stop here, maybe, and we can have a discussion about all this. I'm sure that you have many questions. You will have many questions or queries, because that was a very abstract presentation of the contents of the book. So maybe we can explore the details in what follows. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yannis. I have myself a lot of questions, but I would ask before if there are already some other questions or comments so far. Okay. Kira, go ahead.
Thank you at first for this very interesting insight into your book. I was wondering if you could maybe address a bit more how you understand the relationship of populism and democracy, or maybe even populism as a democratic political practice, and also how, especially in the European context, populism can be disarticulated from this very right-wing context and maybe be reused again in a more left and democratic way. And if you have any thoughts on how, especially in the European context, this kind of view, this very negative view on populism can be addressed and maybe even used as a strategy for the left to bring it back into something democratic and something that is addressing very much left and issues instead of the connection to the right wing. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot. No, I think this is a crucial question, obviously. And this is something that is present in the whole of the book, let's say. I mean, it's one of the main themes of the book. And I think it is also, I don't think it is that difficult in the sense, it is obviously difficult, but in the sense that even mainstream analysts of populism accept that. For example, if you read the introductory book by Mühlbauer and Wasser, and also their previous work, the populism can be both a corrective or a risk for democracy. So if it is a corrective, it means that democracy, and we know that there is a big current within political theory that talks about post-democracy, the way that representative democracy, liberal democracy has been changing over time. And currently, there are some problems around sovereignty and other issues that have to be resolved in order to arrive into a more radical or a more democratic future, present and future. So even within the mainstream, this is becoming to be accepted to a certain extent. This is my first point. Of course, and also within populism research, it's not only Lacan that stresses that, or this current that stresses that. I mean, I remember Margaret Canavan, who is one of the most interesting analysts of populism, starting from a more traditional political theory perspective. And she says, for example, that, especially in her late work, that populism is a specter of democracy in the sense that it is always like a specter, a shade. You know, whenever you get into the sun, your body generates a shade, a specter. You cannot do without that unless you are a ghost or something. So populism will be always present when you have a democratic system, when you have even a representative democratic system, particularly I would say when you have a representative democratic system, because through representation, you have some sort of a group that governs, and that group, in many cases, fails to deliver on the promise of popular sovereignty, which is one of the central promises of democratic government. And because of this failure, or because of this sometimes it is a perceived failure, sometimes but you know, what people think is what takes place in reality. Okay, they have this feeling. In many cases, it is a justified feeling. We know, if you read Piketty, if you read and other people, you see that there is growing inequality, there is injustice, there are very good reasons why people feel that they are not represented, that they are not, their voice is not heard. And so, I mean, it's not that it's a feeling which is bizarre, which has no base on reality and so on and so forth. So this polarization that exists in society, this extreme increase in inequality, will manifest itself within politics. There's no way we can keep that out of politics. And when it manifests itself within politics, it will refer to this basic principle of democratic government, which is popular sovereignty. This is the political grammar of modernity. It will refer to that, and then you will have a populist movement. And then the issue becomes, with what particular ideological baggage is this idea of popular sovereignty articulated? So in some cases, you have an articulation with egalitarian ideas, with radical democratic ideals that demand a progressive rearticulation of democratic government. And so in some other cases, you have a reactionary articulation of this demand. But in these cases, usually populism is not very central. I mean, we have research, for example, now that the research by Senchol Kim, who was in Germany, who is still in Germany, I think, for many years at Humboldt and elsewhere, who has studied, he has just published a book about Hungary. I mean, in Hungary, Orban starts as a liberal politician and then becomes a nationalist politician with very brief populist spells. He uses some populist rhetoric, like Trump, for example, but the main orientation is authoritarian, is illiberal, is nationalist. And then suddenly we end up discussing Orban as the prime example of populism. No, he's not the prime example of populism. The populist canon, the populist historical canon is not authoritarian, is not reactionary, is not, I mean, we just need to read history to understand that. And to examine how and why these populist stereotypes that populism is authoritarian, is right-wing, have emerged, and how they have become part of the mainstream in Europe. And when we do that, we can very easily criticize them, I think. I want to say something else with regards to your question, that because there is also a debate within the left, and there is right-wing anti-populism and there is left-wing anti-populism. And the problem here is similar. I mean, Lacan and other people who talk about left-wing populism or progressive populism or democratic populism or egalitarian populism are not, they don't produce something out of their own imagination. There is a very long tradition within the left that deals with the people that, and I can give you a couple of examples. For example, if you read the biographies of Marx, especially the ones that were produced very recently, it turns out that during his old age, he becomes very much interested on populism, on Russian populism, which was the main populist movement existing at the time. He starts to learn Russian. He gets in contact, and also the Russian populists contact him, because the Russian populists are also socialists. They are not all Marxists, but they are also socialists and are very progressive in that sense, against Tsarist authoritarianism. Yeah, of course, it's a very complex movement. Some of them are anarchists, some of them are socialists, some of them. It's a very complex movement with many different currents. But they are interested in Marx's work. There is a correspondence between some of them, Vera Zasulich, for example, a very famous letter by Vera Zasulich, and the reply by Marx, in which Marx says that Russia is not bound to follow the development of that happened in England or in Germany or in France, and it can have its own trajectory. And there he develops this link with Russian populists, which is very rarely discussed within the left. Of course, there is literature which deals with that, but it's very rarely discussed. And also, I can give you a second example, the strategy of the popular fronts against fascism in the 1930s. In the 1930s, you have popular fronts in France, which are very successful in electoral terms, and they produce a lot of reforms that are still, some of these are still relevant today. You have the popular front in Spain, of course, a very short-lived phenomenon, but you have an idea which is implicitly populist. And I think that Laclau and Mouffe draw on this tradition. So it's not something that is very new for the left. It is a strategy that was always there, and it just needs to be reactivated, and it has been reactivated in many cases. For example, I think Syriza used tactically, not very strategically, but tactically used as an electoral platform a certain populist discourse. Of course, populism does not solve all the problems. You still have other systemic constraints. You have an international situation that you have to deal with. You have other, so it's not the panacea, it's not the end of our problems for the left. It is just a strategy that can be successful within certain conditions. Also Podemos in Spain, which was directly inspired by Laclau and Mouffe in the first phase, and so on and so forth. So I think, I mean, my view on that is that we need to read more history. We need to contextualize populism and also to engage more reflexively with this concept in this category. And if we do all that, it is very easy to move into a more nuanced position. Otherwise, we will keep reproducing the same stereotypes which are completely unfounded and have been delegitimized in many contexts.
Maybe, Josef, maybe you go on.
Thank you, Yannis, for the introduction and for your input. And my question is related to the last thing that you mentioned. I wrote a book from Tobias Bose, and he wrote about the history of the populism, and he mentioned the Narodniki that you also mentioned earlier in this session. And there were a bunch of left-wing people, anarchists, and so on and so forth. And me, as an anarchist, can ask myself if, per definition, anarchism is populism, in the sense that anarchism per se tries to criticize power structures, tries to deconstruct hierarchy and binary thinking, and also they are always, if you read the books of Noam Chomsky, for example, David Graeber, not so much John Holloway, but especially Noam Chomsky, and his rhetoric against elite thinking and elites, it seems to me that yeah, many anarchists are populists, maybe in the positive sense. So yeah, what can your reply? I'm interested in your reply to this. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big issue. Once more, there's a big debate on the link between populism and socialism, populism and anarchism, and so on and so forth. I think you are right in the sense that you have, in populism also, you have a defense of the lower sectors of the population, the poor, the excluded, and so on and so forth. So there are common elements, obviously. One of the problems that need to be discussed is what is, of course, because populism is the answer, is a certain solution to a strategic problem, which is the problem of the political subject. What is the political subject of change? And for populism, it is the people. The people have to articulate themselves. Lacan argues that they articulate themselves on the basis of a certain equivalence. The different demands come together and they produce a popular subject that can push forward change and demand change, and so on and so forth. But for other versions of the left, it is not the people which is the proper. I mean, for a very traditional left-wing perspective, it would be the working class. But I believe there is a misunderstanding there because there is left-wing elitism also. The idea was that the left has political economy, a very scientific way of analyzing the situation, and that also produces a certain solution to the strategic problem, precisely because the working class as a category is excluded or being marginalized. The working class will be the popular subject of change. But this is not automatic. It has to be mediated by discourse. And sometimes people, I mean, it's not that all workers have a political economist in their minds and they can just so easily translate their situation into the jargon of political economy. And maybe they can identify much more easily with the people and so on and so forth. But this is something that the left is not always recognizing. So this is the big issue. From an anarchist perspective, there is also a criticism of the people because the people to a certain extent implies a certain prioritization of verticalism, let's say. That has to do with the idea of leadership. And Lacan has been criticized along these lines also. Because you need some sort of leader, you need some sort of leading idea at least, like popular sovereignty or the people and so on and so forth, that leads the way. And for some anarchist currents, in some anarchist currents, you have a much more horizontalist understanding of politics. So you don't. So these people and these thinkers do not really want to accept the people or the populist leader or the populist leadership as a proper way forward. I think this is not. I mean, there are problems with leadership, obviously, and we have to be very, very careful in this situation. But on the other hand, there are problems with extreme horizontalism because I can give you an example. For example, the North American situation with Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street was more or less a horizontal movement, and it decided to stay like that. What happened? It disappeared completely. And then one could argue maybe that there was some sort of energy that was then channeled into the campaign of Bernie Sanders. So you need some sort of reference to some sort of project like the project by Bernie Sanders, to a particular incarnation in a leading idea or a particular leader, at least for a certain period, in order for this thing to be manifested in a more distinct and powerful movement. It's not always the case, but it is an issue. And I remember reading the book by Rodrigo Nunes on horizontalism and verticalism, which is very interesting because it says, okay, there are problems with verticalism, but there are also many problems with horizontalism. And you actually need both. You actually need both. You need some sort of dialectic, you need some sort of articulation of the two moments in order to have a more robust, progressive egalitarian movement. And I think this is the basic idea of Lacan also, because Lacan also was not somebody who was in favor of leadership or anything like that without any constraints. No, and he stresses a lot of times there are 2 or 3 very direct passages in his work in which he says, of course, you need some sort of verticalism if you want to have a robust movement, or a party if you stay within electoral politics. But on the other hand, you cannot rely solely on that. You need some sort of coordination of the multitude, of course, with reference to the people, but then you need this horizontal dimension. Without this horizontal dimension, you end up with a new bureaucracy, you end up with something that you don't want to have. And it will not be able to deliver the goods. So from both sides, I think from the horizontal point of view, there is now a realization that horizontalism is not enough. You need some sort of organization in order to be able to deliver the goods. But on the other hand, there is also a realization from the more vertical side and left-wing populism that this is not enough again. You need some sort of relationship with the horizontal level. So this is a promising avenue. This is this articulation of the horizontal and the vertical provides a very promising avenue for progressive politics in the future, I think.
I was just reminded in this case about the criticism from Antonio Negri on Lacan about sovereignty and how populism, in his sense, can only work, I don't know, maybe in the national context. Maybe, yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on this. And what I thought more general is that we have like populism as a oscillating phenomenon, I think, in political theory between some kind of concept or term to analyze movements, for example, political parties, and on the other hand, as a kind of battle cry, where on the one hand, maybe from the liberal side, Jan Werner Müller wrote "What is Populism?" and said populism is a really anti-pluralist phenomenon, and on the other side, maybe there is Chantal Mouffe's for left populism, where she tried to rewrite the phenomenon as a form of democratizing, or to stress its democratizing function. And I would like to know, like, your opinion, because you developed kind of an referential approach between populism and anti-populism, and how these two concepts, especially in discourse, influence each other. And to my sense, there is this kind of what you describe as double hermeneutics between like the academic discourse or the media discourse, and maybe you can try to give me a better explanation what I can make out of this argumentation.
I'm not sure whether I can do all that, because you have raised a lot of issues, I think, and slightly different issues. But I can say a few words about each of the themes that you have highlighted. The thing about Negri, of course, there was a debate between Lacan and Negri, and the criticism of Lacan is that the multitude posed by Negri presupposes some sort of automatic, it was like like the schema by Marx, that the working class will emerge and automatically all these people will develop class consciousness and will be able to overturn the capitalist system. Well, this did not happen, because obviously this is not an automatic process, and the same will apply to the multitude. It will not automatically produce itself as the agent of change. I mean, this is a problem with Negri, and of course we have recent with regard to sovereignty and the nation. We have recent events like the pandemic or the war now that show that the nation is not dead, that the nation state is not dead. There are many issues that bring it back to the center of the debate. So I think this was a very quick passage beyond the people, beyond the nation state, and this we have to discuss. We have to discuss all these issues again. Of course, a lot of these concepts can be very problematic. Of course, I can refer to the people in order to push forward an authoritarian agenda. I can refer to the nation state in order to push forward the totalitarian agenda. I can refer to sovereignty for good or for bad. There's no guarantee that it will be a progressive movement, but that applies to all concepts. It applies to our personal life. Somebody says to us, I love you. Are we certain that he or she loves us? No, we don't know that. There is uncertainty. There is risk always. And this applies to liberals. This both to liberals and to a version of the left. There is no guarantee. There is no guarantee that people will be truthful or that they really describe a reality that exists and guarantees our rights, our demands will be heard, and so on and so forth. So we have to judge this distance between ideal or invocation and what happens on the ground. And of course, we don't. It is not that we choose each time how exactly we are going to proceed on the basis of our own ideas. I mean, this is something that Marx accepted in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. He says, of course, men make their history, but they don't make it in conditions they choose themselves. There are conditions that we have to take into account. And also popular sovereignty, it's one of these conditions. It's one of these conditions that maybe we could use in a progressive orientation. But there are many conditions that we have to take into account. It is not that we can suddenly create ex nihilo, a new universe in which everything will be easy and automatically a better prospect will present itself. So this is one of the problems. Now, of course, populism is the material of our study within populism research. But on the other hand, I mentioned that already from my initial presentation. It is also a battle cry. It is also a political slogan. It is also part of the political grammar of modernity. And this we use both as researchers and as citizens, because we are all citizens. We vote, we don't vote, we vote for this, we vote for that. And what we do in our research will obviously interact in some way with our different hat as a citizen. There's no way to avoid that. And of course, only that way we can make sure that our research will have something to say about real politics, and it will be meaningful to people who are around us. So it's not a bad thing that we have to eliminate. I think it is one of these constraints and one of these facts of life that we have to take into account. And moving to the last issue that you mentioned, I mean, it was a double hermeneutics. It was the idea, Jan Werner Müller. Yes, I think the problem, I mean, I have no disagreement with Jan Werner Müller. I mean, obviously we are in favor of democracy, we're in favor of all these nice things and so on and so forth. I think the problem with this very mainstream liberal critique of populism is that they paint a very rosy picture of liberal democracy. They don't, or maybe I should not be so critical. I think they take into account the problems of existing liberal democracy and representative democracy, but they don't take them into account in the required degree, I think. Or they think that they will resolve themselves out of some internal movement of liberal democracy itself. They don't realize that the liberal democratic hybrid, this paradoxical hybrid that Chantal Mouffe has been describing, and also other people like Macpherson, that liberalism and democracy come from different sides. Liberalism is initially a rather oligarchic phenomenon. And then it blends itself with democracy, and you have the rule of majority, popular sovereignty from the democratic side, and you have rights and all these things from the liberal side, and then you end up with this very important hybrid with liberal democracy. But this happens through struggle. It does not happen because the elites or the oligarchy or the establishment is very nice and wants to grant rights to other people and so on. No, I don't think it works like that. It works through struggle, and then you end up in some sort of compromise, which creates this framework. But this historical contextualization means that you always need a political subject which will push for democratic reforms, for enriching democracy, for deepening democracy. What is this subject in this liberal mainstream approach? You don't have a collective subject which is powerful enough and wants to push forward these reforms. You only have the voters, the individual. You have an individualism. You have the voters that. But the voters are not enough. Democracy does not happen every 4 or 5 years because when we go to vote. Democracy has to function, has to operate through time. And you need the articulation of a political subject that will press for further democratization and so on and so forth. And this is what the theory of populism articulated by Lacan and Mouffe highlights. That you need this subject. Without this subject, you will not have liberal democracy. This is the problem that they don't seem to realize. And of course, this issue of anti-populism is very important. This is the last thing I'm going to say because I have been talking a lot. Because you mentioned anti-populism, and this is one of the issues that we wanted to highlight within Populism and in our publications. Because, I mean, it's very important for a series of reasons. It is very important politically. You mentioned that in your question. It is very important also in terms of material when you do research, because, for example, in Europe, nobody wants to identify as populist because it is a very pejorative word. It is almost an index of danger, of imminent danger. So nobody identifies with that. So what you basically have in abundance is anti-populist discourse. It's through the analysis of anti-populist discourse that you can first realize who are the populists, who are in favor of the people, why these are not seen as legitimate and cannot be accepted by the mainstream and so on and so forth. So the material, the discursive material you have is usually anti-populist. And this is very important. We have to study this. On the other hand, this is also relevant to a post-structuralist approach. Because if you read Saussure, for example, the basis of modern linguistics, which is something very influential in post-structuralism and in Lacan and Mouffe, Saussure talks about the dialectic between identity and difference. You cannot define a certain identity without differentiating it from something else. So you need to, in order to identify what is populist, you have to start with what is anti-populist, what is against this particular type of identification. So there are very good reasons why we should very carefully study anti-populism. And this has been a very, very fruitful avenue of research in our own research and publications. Thank you.
I think, to my mind, I think we have this kind of problem still, even if I don't know, we take Lacan or move as a theoretical basis, for example, for a concept of populism, or on the other side, I don't know, maybe more other approaches like the ones of Karlsruhe or Rovira Kaltwasser, that there's always this kind of normative bias which you mentioned, because we are also citizens and we are, or as researchers, for example. And I don't know how to avoid this in this whole discourse, because I have the feeling what you mentioned as an anti-populist discourse, for example, in the media, then we have also this anti-populist discourse to some extent, maybe from Jan Werner Müller, because with such a conception of populism, to my mind, you can always identify really easily the far right in his definition as populist, but not so much progressive movements. And yeah, I don't find a solution to that other as articulating, for example, in political theory, how we can understand as a normative term populism as a strategy of democratization, for example, to give also a political articulation against this liberal critique on populism. And on the other side, how to understand it still as a analytical concept for analysis. To my mind, I always have to differentiate between this, because I feel a bit stuck in a dilemma in this whole discourse that you described.
But yes, I can understand that, but there is no way to resolve this issue once and for all. And this applies not only to populism, it applies to all different categories that we use in political theory and political science and so on and so forth. All of them are research scientific categories on the one hand, but on the other hand, they can become the vehicles for addressing particular social and political problems, and also have normative implications and so on and so forth. So there is no way to resolve that. The only thing we can do is to try to bracket some of these stereotypes we have. We all have stereotypes. We need some serious effort to bracket them. It will not be possible to bracket them completely, but maybe we can arrive at a little bit more reflexive understanding, and reading history, reading political theory, reading how people dealt with these categories 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and what happens today, and the implications of our discourse. For example, let me give you an example. If we call the far right or the nationalist right or even authoritarian or neo-Nazi movements, if we call them populist, it is like we are making them a big favor because they like that. If people are going to describe you as a Nazi or as authoritarian or as a fascist or as a totalitarian person, and instead of that they call you populist, that is to say they associate your politics with the people, you will like that. It is part of the main, and this is part of the mainstreaming of the far right. The far right becomes associated with one of the founding principles of liberal democracy. Do we really want that? On the one hand, it is a mistake because these people refer marginally to popular sovereignty in order to further a very not in order to promote popular empowerment, but to promote another hierarchy, another elite that somehow is considered more intuitively related to the people. But this has nothing to do with popular empowerment. Institutionally and in other ways, it has nothing to do with popular empowerment. So it is a very bizarre use of the people. And then if we call these people, if we develop a theory that these are the prime examples of populism, we do them a very big favor. And they like that, they accept that. It is better for them to call them populists than to call them fascist. Do we really want to do that? It's a question. I would go in the opposite direction, I think. But of course, it is not possible to resolve once and for all this problem. There is going to be this double hermeneutics, this interplay between the normative level and the analytical level, and so on and so forth. But the question is, if we can be a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more reflexive, if we can really take into account the history of these movements, the history of the concepts, if we understand the story of liberal democracy, and only if we do these things, we'll be able to defend the liberal democracy against the various threats that currently challenge liberal democracy. And there are many threats around. So we need to do that very seriously, I think.
I mean, I think also like the etymology of the word, like coming from populus, maybe direct even more, progressive understanding, which is possible to my mind of the term. I think, I don't know.
Yeah, of course. There you have this idea sometimes that yes, of course, these people refer to the people, but this is not a sincere invocation of popular sovereignty or the democratic people and so on and so forth. But there is a problem there also, because then you end up with associating political theory with reality testing, that the main purpose of political theory is to judge whether a politician tells the truth, or whether he is or she is sincerely in favor of democracy or popular sovereignty, or whether he or she uses it in a rhetorical way simply to gain votes. And the implication for these people is that only the extreme implication of that is that only populists lie. But this is not the case. A liberal can also lie. A liberal can also lie. A conservative can also tell lies. Everybody lies. It's not only the populists who lie. And this is very well, I remember there is a passage in the introductory book by Müde and Kaldwasser, which goes very much against this orientation, that populism has to do with people who just say something in order to gain votes and so on and so forth. This can happen, obviously. Of course it can happen. It can happen everywhere. With liberals, conservatives, with social democrats, with everybody. It is not a defining characteristic of populism.
For me, it's always interesting, like the etymology of the words also, like, for example, how a democracy was considered, I don't know, 100 years ago, from its 1000 years ago, from its normative standpoint, and how it is really positively considered now. And I think this is similar with every.
That's true. That's true. I mean, democracy would put you in jail a couple of 100 years ago, maybe less. Sometimes it can put you in jail even now.
Yeah. I don't know. Josef, do you have another question, or Patrick maybe?
Yeah, sure. To get back to your point, in my personal view, I like the emotional turns introduced by feminists, and with this theory or analytical approach, I understand better how, for example, in my left liberal bubble, populists are orchestrated like the pure examples of irrational people. So with the emotional turn, when emotions in the center, in the analytical center, then you can understand, okay, how is this game played between the ones who are the intellectuals and the the rational ones and the irrational ones. So this is a game that is played between liberals and anti-liberal populism. So but my question is not related to this. My question is, I never saw, but I'm not an expert on populism, but I never saw or read a theory on neoliberal populism, because, for example, there is this meritocratic myth of that everybody can do it and everybody can achieve their success and their goals. He or she just have to try it hard enough. We know this story. This is the American dream, the American way of life. We know that story. And there is other components of this, what I have examined. It's the anti-egalitarian discourse, the anti-egalitarian rhetoric, and also anti-communist rhetoric. So this, for example, in Bulgaria, where my mother is from, I can see the anti-communist rhetoric very in a harsh way from the neoliberals. So this neoliberal rhetoric and discourse that is now, and not only by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, we can see it nowadays. Is this a kind of neoliberal populism, or is it far right-wing populism? Because I did not see any distinction, and is it a new term? Should it be invented? And what's your opinion on this?
Let me say, thank you very much. Let me say something first about your the first part of your question, what we said, because you mentioned this affective turn and the role of emotions and affect. I think this is a very important issue because both in politics, in this liberal mainstream, and in science, in the social sciences, there is an exclusion of affectivity. These are very rationalist projects. The social science and political science has been a very rational choice. Theories and so on and so forth have been dominating the field. And it's not only in the last 2-3 decades that this is changing. And this is coming also into populism research also. We have the work by a lot of people like Emmy Eklund, Nikos Demergis, and other people, many people that I forget at the moment, who are doing amazing work on emotions, affectivity, and politics. And also this was something very important for Laclau and Mouffe, because they thought that a really powerful popular political subject can only emerge if populist discourse is a discourse which is invested with passion and which is invested with energy in order to have strong political implications. So I think this is a very important intuition, both in research terms and in political terms. And this is often forgotten by either the mainstream in politics or the mainstream within the social and political science. So this is my first point. The second point, if I come to your real question, the second part of what you said about neoliberal populism, there was a literature on neo-populism, which was basically dealing with Latin America, and mainly referring to some neoliberal projects like the one by Menem or the Alberto Fujimori and so on and so forth, who wanted to push forward the neoliberal agenda, and they did that with some sort of rhetoric which was described as populist. But I don't think it was real populism. I mean, I'm not persuaded that populism is the best word or the right word to describe this phenomenon, because these people, as you say, which goes also to the other thing that you mentioned about anti-egalitarian discourses, because these discourses are, or meritocratic discourses, these discourses are very elitist, they are very hierarchical, they are very much against the people, they are against this idea of popular empowerment. Maybe they do it in a way which is more popular in the sense of popular culture. They express themselves in a way which is more accessible and so on and so forth. But that does not make them populist, I think. It would be an exaggeration to call these discourses populist. I think they are the lower part of anti-populist discourses in my analysis. Now, I don't know about Bulgaria, so I cannot really comment on that, but I think that what I said addresses your question. I mean, I can understand what you mean. Very often these discourses seem to engage with a style or with a rhetoric which is more accessible, which draws on popular culture, which wants to, and it can be very successful in mobilizing the lower classes. We saw that with Trump in the American situation. But I don't think this actually makes them populist. Maybe they incorporate some elements, but they are at the core elitist, hierarchical discourses that in most cases hate popular empowerment, and they are not really interested in furthering this. So I would not describe them as populist.
I think when no one has any more questions, thank you very much, Yannis, for this, for your presentation of your book, which or the updated, maybe a bit different version I would like to read in English, because I still can't read any Greek. And we hope to have another discussion soon. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
And wish everyone a great evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.